What if the first murderer never died? Most people read the story of Cain and Abel as a simple tale of jealousy and divine punishment. Genesis 4,008 tells us that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. But here is what most readers miss. The Bible never records Cain's death. Every other major figure in Genesis gets a death notice. Adam died. Seth died. Even Methuselah, who lived longer than anyone, has his death carefully recorded. But Cain, he simply vanishes from the text. Scripture is silent, and that silence should trouble us. Most people assume Cain died somewhere in the land of Nod, forgotten and alone. But history and tradition tell a different story. Ancient texts suggest something far stranger happened to the first murderer. In this narrative, we will move through three critical discoveries. First, we will examine what actually happened in that field between two brothers and why God's response was so unusual. Then, we will explore the mysterious mark God placed on Cain and what it really meant. Finally, we will follow Cain into the land of Nod and discover what he found there, who he met, and why his story might not have ended at all. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The murder itself happened quickly. Cain and Abel were in the field. The text gives us no dialogue, no warning, no dramatic build-up. One moment they are together. The next moment Abel is dead. Genesis 4,008 is shockingly brief. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. That is all we get. No weapon is mentioned. No motive is explained beyond the rejected sacrifice. No final words from Abel, just sudden, brutal violence. But then something strange happens. God does not appear immediately. There is no divine intervention to stop the murder. No angel arrives to protect Abel. The act is completed, and only then does God arrive with a question. Where is Abel, your brother? God asks in Genesis 4,009. Cain responds with one of the most famous lines in Scripture. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The defiance is stunning. Cain does not confess. He does not show remorse. He challenges God directly. God's response reveals something most people overlook. What have you done? God asks. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Notice the language here. Abel's blood is not silent. It is not merely spilled. It is crying out. It has a voice. It speaks. This is not metaphor. Ancient Hebrew understands blood as carrying the life force, the nephesh, the very essence of a person. When Abel's blood soaked into the earth, it did not simply disappear. It created a permanent spiritual mark, a testimony that could not be erased. Now here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. God does not kill Cain. He does not strike him down. He does not even directly curse him. Read Genesis 4:11 carefully. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. The curse is not on Cain himself. It is between Cain and the ground. The earth itself has become Cain's enemy. The soil that once produced crops will no longer yield to him. He is cut off from the source of life, from the ability to cultivate and grow. This is a punishment far more sophisticated than simple death. Cain is being separated from the created order itself. He is being exiled not just from his family, but from the fundamental relationship between human beings and the earth. Genesis 2:7 tells us that Adam was formed from the dust of the ground. Humanity and earth are intimately connected. To be cursed from the ground is to be cursed from your own origin, from the substance of your being. Cain understands this immediately. His response in Genesis 4:13-14 is telling. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Notice what Cain fears most. Not the curse itself, not the inability to farm. He fears being killed by whoever finds me. This phrase should stop every reader cold. Whoever finds me? Who else is there? According to the Genesis timeline, the human population at this moment consists of Adam, Eve, and Cain. Abel is dead. No other children have been mentioned yet. So who are these people Cain fears? Who are these potential murderers wandering the earth? The text offers no explanation. It simply records Cain's fear and moves on. But this single phrase opens a door to mysteries that scholars have debated for thousands of years. It suggests that the world beyond Eden was not empty. It suggests that Cain knew something about what existed outside his family circle. It suggests that the Genesis account is not telling us everything. And then God does something remarkable. He protects Cain. Genesis 4:15 records God's promise, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And then comes the crucial phrase, "And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him." A mark, a sign, a visible indicator that would protect the first murderer from violence. But what was this mark? The text does not say. And that absence of description has generated centuries of speculation, legend, and theological debate. What kind of mark would protect a murderer? What symbol could be so powerful that it would stop anyone from harming Cain? Some traditions say it was a Hebrew letter inscribed on his forehead. Others suggest a physical deformity or transformation. Still others propose it was not a physical mark at all, but a spiritual aura, a field of divine protection that surrounded Cain wherever he went. But here is the question that should haunt us. Why would God protect the first murderer? Why would the divine judge who just cursed Cain also ensure his safety? The answer may lie in what Cain represented. He was not just a murderer, he was a test case. He was the first human being to choose violence against another human. He was the prototype of all future sin, all future rebellion, all future attempts to usurp divine authority. And perhaps God needed Cain to live, needed him to continue, needed him to carry forward into the world as a living warning, a breathing testimony to what happens when humans reject God's order. Cain's existence would serve as a permanent reminder that sin has consequences, that violence cannot be undone, that some choices change everything forever. But there is another possibility, one that ancient texts hint at but never fully explain. What if the mark was not just protection? What if it was also a doorway? What if it granted Cain access to knowledge, to power, to spiritual realms that were supposed to remain closed to humanity? What if God's mark was both a curse and a terrible gift? Chapter 2. When blood speaks, Abel's blood crying from the ground is one of the most haunting images in all of Scripture. But what does it actually mean? Is this poetic language, or is something more literal happening? The Hebrew word used here is tak, which means to cry out in distress, to call for help, to demand justice. This is not quiet mourning. This is an urgent scream. The blood itself becomes a witness, a prosecutor, a voice that cannot be silenced. Ancient Israelites understood blood as sacred. Leviticus 17:11 makes this explicit, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." Blood is not just a bodily fluid, it carries the nephes, the living essence of a person. When blood is spilled, the life force is released into the world. And according to Scripture, that life force does not simply disappear. This belief is consistent throughout biblical text. When animals were sacrificed, their blood had to be handled with extreme care. It could not be consumed. It had to be poured out on the altar or at the base of the altar. Why? Because the blood represented the life given in exchange for sin. It was a cosmic transaction, a spiritual exchange that had real power and real consequences. Blood was the currency of atonement, the substance that could bridge the gap between human sin and divine holiness. But Abel's blood was not sacrificial. It was murder. It was life taken by violence, not offered in worship. And that distinction matters. When blood is shed in sacrifice, it fulfills a divine purpose. When blood is shed in murder, it creates a rupture in the created order. It introduces chaos where there should be harmony. It breaks the fundamental law that was given even before the Mosaic covenant. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Genesis 9:6 declares, this is not just a legal principle, it is a cosmic law. Abel's blood crying from the ground means that his murder created a permanent spiritual disturbance. The earth itself became a witness. The soil absorbed not just blood, but injustice, and that injustice could not be hidden. God tells Cain in Genesis 4:10, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. The blood speaks directly to God. It has a relationship with the divine. It testifies, it accuses, it demands response. This concept appears again later in Scripture. Hebrews 12:24 speaks of Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Here, the author of Hebrews directly contrasts two kinds of blood. Abel's blood cries out for vengeance, for justice, for retribution. Jesus' blood speaks a better word, a word of mercy, forgiveness, reconciliation. But both bloods speak, both have voices, both create spiritual realities that transcend the physical act of their shedding. So what happened to the ground where Abel died? Did it remain cursed? Jewish tradition holds that the field where Abel was killed became barren, that nothing would grow there for generations. Some legends say that even animals avoided the spot, that birds would not land there, that rain would not properly soak the soil. The earth itself remembered what happened. The earth itself bore witness. This idea that the earth has memory is not unique to Judaism. Ancient cultures worldwide recognized that land could be defiled by violence. Blood guilt was a real concept, something that attached itself to places and people. It had to be cleansed through ritual, through sacrifice, through intentional spiritual action. You could not simply forget about murder and move on. The land would not let you. Cain's curse was specifically tied to this reality. Genesis 4:12 records God's words. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. The ground opened its mouth. This is startling language. The earth is personified. It has agency. It responds to what happened. It received Abel's blood, and now it rejects Cain's labor. This is why Cain's punishment was so devastating. In an agricultural society, being unable to farm was essentially a death sentence. You could not grow food. You could not sustain yourself. You became dependent on others or forced to wander as a nomad, always moving, never settling, never building, never establishing roots. Cain would become a fugitive and a wanderer, Genesis 4:12 declares. The Hebrew words are nar, and nar means restless, homeless, fleeing. Nad means wandering, shaking, unsteady. Together they paint a picture of someone who can never rest, never find peace, never arrive. But here is what makes this even more complex. The curse was not total annihilation. It was exile. It was separation. It was being cut off from blessing, but not from existence. Cain would continue to live. He would continue to function. But he would do so outside the presence of God, outside the fertility of Eden's influence, outside the community of his family. He would become the first human being to experience complete spiritual alienation. Genesis 4:16 marks the transition. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This phrase is crucial. Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. In Hebrew, this is milifnei Yahweh, from the face of Yahweh. The divine presence was understood to be localized in certain ways. God dwelt in Eden. God walked in the garden in the cool of the day. God's presence was tangible, accessible, real. To leave the presence of the Lord meant to enter a space where that tangible access no longer existed. The land of Nod becomes Cain's new reality. But what was this place, and who lived there? The name itself is revealing. Nod comes from the root nad, which means to wander. So the land of Nod is literally the land of wandering. It is not a specific geographical location in the way Egypt or Canaan would be. It is a state of being. It is the realm of the exile, the place of those who are cut off, the territory of the spiritually homeless. But if Nod was just empty wilderness, why did Cain fear whoever finds me? Why did he need a protective mark? The question brings us back to the central mystery. Who else was out there? And what did Cain know about them that the text does not tell us? Chapter 3. The mark that changed everything. The mark of Cain is one of the most debated symbols in biblical history. Genesis 4:15 tells us that the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. But the text gives no physical description, no color, no shape, no location on the body. This silence has generated thousands of years of interpretation, speculation, and theological imagination. Jewish tradition offers several possibilities. One ancient view found in rabbinic commentary suggests that God inscribed a letter on Cain's forehead, specifically the letter Vav, which is the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Why Vav? Because it represents connection, the ability to link heaven and earth. It appears in the divine name Yahweh. Some rabbis taught that this letter both protected Cain and marked him as separate, as someone who carried the weight of unprecedented sin. Other Jewish sources propose that the mark was not written but physical. Some say Cain grew a horn from his forehead, a visible deformity that would identify him immediately. This tradition connects to later stories about Cain's death, where he is supposedly killed by Lamech, who mistakes him for an animal because of the horn. Other traditions suggest that Cain's face became pale or changed color, that his skin took on an unusual appearance that marked him as different from other humans. Christian interpretation has also varied widely. Some early church fathers believed the mark was a visible trembling, a constant shaking that would identify Cain wherever he went. This connects to the Hebrew gnat in his punishment, the idea of being unsteady, never at rest. Others proposed it was leprosy or some other skin condition that would make Cain recognizable and keep people at a distance. Still others argued it was simply divine proclamation, a spiritual mark invisible to human eyes but recognized by all who encountered Cain through supernatural means. But there is another interpretation that appears in mystical traditions and apocryphal texts. This view suggests the mark was not a punishment at all, but a form of protection that also granted power. According to some legends, the mark gave Cain immunity from natural death. It prevented aging. It made him invulnerable to weapons. It allowed him to survive conditions that would kill ordinary humans. In this reading, the mark was both curse and gift, both exile and elevation. This interpretation finds support in an often overlooked detail. God says in Genesis 4:15, "If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." Sevenfold vengeance is an enormous deterrent. It means that anyone who harms Cain will suffer 7 times the punishment. This is divine protection on a scale that seems disproportionate for a murderer. Why would God promise such severe consequences for those who harm Cain? One answer is that Cain's life served a larger purpose. He was not just being punished, he was being preserved. His continued existence was necessary for reasons the text does not fully explain. Perhaps he was meant to be a living warning. Perhaps his lineage was meant to develop in specific ways. Perhaps his experience in the land of Nod was meant to demonstrate something about human nature, about sin, about the consequences of separation from God. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text not included in the biblical canon, offers additional details. It claims that after Cain killed Abel, he was given knowledge by angels, not good angels, but fallen ones. These beings taught him secrets of metalworking, of building, of arts that would allow him to survive outside Eden's blessing. In this account, the mark was connected to this forbidden knowledge. It was a sign that Cain had entered into a different covenant, a pact with powers that operated outside divine approval. This connects to another mysterious detail. When Cain arrives in Nod, he immediately builds a city. Genesis 4017 records, "Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch." When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. This is stunning for several reasons. First, Cain suddenly has a wife. Where did she come from? The text offers no explanation. Second, Cain builds a city. A city requires population, organization, resources, knowledge of architecture and engineering. How did Cain acquire these skills? How did he gather people? How did he transition from wandering fugitive to city founder? The traditional answer is that Cain married one of his sisters, since Adam and Eve had other children according to Genesis 5,004. But this does not explain the other people Cain feared or the sudden appearance of city-building capabilities, unless the mat gave him more than protection, unless it gave him knowledge, unless it connected him to sources of information and power that were not available to his parents. Some mystical traditions teach that the mark of Cain opened spiritual doorways. It allowed him to see and interact with entities that existed in the space between heaven and earth. It gave him access to the Watchers, the fallen angels who would later teach humanity forbidden arts according to 1 Enoch and other ancient texts. In this view, Cain became the first human initiate into occult knowledge, the first person to deliberately pursue power outside God's order. This interpretation makes sense of several otherwise confusing elements. It explains how Cain survived and thrived in Nod. It explains where his wife came from. Perhaps she was from a pre-existing population influenced by fallen entities. It explains the sudden flowering of civilization among his descendants. And it explains why God was so concerned about Cain being killed. If Cain's lineage was meant to demonstrate what happens when humans ally with fallen powers, his death would have interrupted that demonstration. The mark, then, was not just identification, it was initiation. It was a seal that granted access to knowledge and protection in exchange for permanent separation from God's presence. It was the beginning of a parallel human development, one that would run alongside the line of Seth, but operate under different spiritual authority. Cain's mark became the sign of a new kind of human, one who builds and creates not in partnership with God, but in defiance of Him. And if the mark granted immunity from death, then Cain may have lived for centuries, watching his city grow, watching his descendants multiply, watching the consequences of his choice ripple forward through generations. The text never says he died, and that absence may be the most significant detail of all. Chapter 4, East of Eden. The phrase East of Eden has captured imagination for millennia. Genesis 4:16 tells us that Cain settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This directional marker is not accidental. In biblical geography, east carries symbolic weight. Eden was in the east according to Genesis 2008. After Adam and Eve sinned, they were driven out, and God placed cherubim and a flaming sword at the east side of the garden to guard the way to the tree of life, as Genesis 3:24 records. East is the direction of sunrise, of beginnings, but also of exile. When you go east from Eden, you are moving away from the source, away from the center, away from the place where God walked with humanity. East becomes the direction of increasing distance, of deepening separation. Cain going east means he is continuing the trajectory his parents started. He is moving further into exile, further from divine presence. But what was actually in the east? The text calls it Nod, the land of wandering. This name suggests it was not a settled civilization, but a frontier, a wild space beyond the boundaries of Eden's influence. Yet somehow this wilderness becomes the location of the first human city. How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory descriptions? One possibility is that Nod was already inhabited, not by descendants of Adam and Eve, but by others. Genesis 1:26-27 describes God creating humanity in His image, male and female. This happens on the 6th day. Then Genesis 2 provides a more detailed account of creating Adam specifically and placing him in Eden. Some scholars argued these are two different creation accounts describing two different events. Chapter 1 describes a general creation of humanity. Chapter 2 describes the special creation of its specific human, Adam, who is placed in a specific location Eden for a specific purpose. If this interpretation is correct, then the world beyond Eden was already populated with humans created in Genesis 1. These people would not have had the same relationship with God that Adam had. They would not have walked in Eden. They would not have received direct instruction from God. They would have developed their own cultures, their own societies, their own ways of living. And when Cain arrived in their territory, he would have been a stranger, someone different, someone marked. This would explain Cain's fear of whoever finds me. It would explain why he needed a protective mark. It would explain where his wife came from and how he was able to build a city so quickly. He was entering an already existing human population. The sevenfold vengeance threat would have been communicated somehow, perhaps through Cain himself, perhaps through supernatural means, making the inhabitants of Nod unwilling to harm him. Another interpretation draws on ancient Jewish texts that speak of shadowy ones or pre-Adamic beings. These traditions suggest that before Adam, God had created other forms of life that were human-like but not fully human in the way Adam was. Some were angels who had taken physical form. Others were hybrid beings, products of earlier divine experiments in creation. When Cain entered Nod, he encountered these entities. The Book of Enoch, though not canonical, preserves traditions that many scholars believe date to the Second Temple period and may reflect earlier oral traditions. First Enoch describes the Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, who instead descended and took human wives, producing the Nephilim. These events are typically dated to before the flood, during the generations after Cain. But what if the Watchers were already present in Nod when Cain arrived? This would make Cain's city the first place of contact between Adamic humanity and fallen angelic powers. It would explain the rapid technological advancement among Cain's descendants. It would explain the origins of the Nephilim, and it would explain why God eventually decided to destroy the world through the flood. The corruption was not just human sin multiplying. It was the contamination of the human genetic and spiritual line through forbidden mixing with non-human entities. Genesis 4017 records that Cain's wife bore him a son named Enoch, and Cain built a city named after this son. The name Enoch means dedicated or initiated. It carries the sense of being consecrated to something or beginning a new phase. Cain's city was the first time humans organized themselves independently of God's direct oversight. It was the first time people created structure, law, defense, and economy without divine instruction. This city represented a revolutionary idea that humans could create their own order, their own meaning, their own security without reference to God. It was autonomy made concrete. It was the fruit of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, taken to its logical conclusion. Adam and Eve wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. Cain went further. He wanted to build a world where God was not needed at all. The city's existence raises practical questions that the text does not answer. What materials did Cain use? Where did he get knowledge of architecture? How did he organize labor? How did he convince or compel others to participate in this project? Unless he had help, unless the beings in Nod, whether other humans or something else, contributed their knowledge and labor, unless Cain was not working alone but in partnership with powers that had their own reasons for wanting human civilization to develop in this direction. East of Eden, then, becomes not just a geographical location, but a spiritual territory. It is the space where humanity experiments with autonomy. It is the realm where alternative knowledge and alternative power operate. It is the place where the consequences of separation from God play out in real time, in real cities, in real human choices. And Cain stands at the beginning of this experiment, marked, protected, building, creating a legacy that would last until the flood and perhaps beyond. Because if Cain never died, if the mark granted him immortality, then he witnessed the entire pre-flood world. He saw his descendants multiply. He saw the Watchers descend. He saw the Nephilim born. He saw violence fill the earth. He saw God's grief. He saw the rains begin, and perhaps he survived even that. Chapter 5, the people who should not exist. The question of Cain's wife has troubled readers since ancient times. Genesis 4017 states matter-of-factly, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. The text offers no introduction, no explanation, no backstory. She simply appears. But where did she come from? If the human race consisted of Adam, Eve, Cain, and the deceased Abel, the mathematics do not work. The traditional answer is that Cain married one of his sisters. Genesis 5:4 tells us that Adam lived 800 years after Seth was born and had other sons and daughters. The assumption is that some of these children were born before Cain's exile and that he took one of his sisters with him or she joined him later. In the early generations, when the human population was small and genetic diversity was maximal, sibling marriage would have been necessary and not yet prohibited. This explanation satisfies some but raises other questions. If Cain married a sister, why does the text not mention her until he reaches Nod? Why is there no record of conflict or conversation with Adam and Eve about this? Why does Cain fear whoever finds me, killing him, if the only humans alive are his parents and siblings? The text's silence on these points suggests something more complex. Another explanation, popular among certain scholars and theologians, is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 describe two separate creation events. Genesis 1027 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." This is presented as a completed act on the sixth day of creation. Then Genesis 2 provides a detailed narrative of God forming Adam from dust and creating Eve from his rib. Some interpret this as describing two different groups. Genesis 1 describes the creation of humanity in general, people who spread across the earth and formed various populations. Genesis 2 describes the specific creation of Adam and Eve, who are placed in Eden for a unique purpose to serve as representatives of humanity in a covenantal relationship with God. When Cain leaves Eden and enters the wider world, he encounters the descendants of the Genesis 1 humans, people who were created in God's image but who had never lived in Eden or received direct revelation from God. This framework would explain numerous textual oddities. It would explain the people Cain feared. It would explain where his wife came from. It would explain how he could build a city so quickly. It would explain the later reference in Genesis 6:1-2 to the sons of God and the daughters of men, which many interpret as referring to different human lines. The sons of God would be the line of Seth, maintaining connection to the Edenic covenant. The daughters of men would be the pre-Adamic populations outside Eden. But there is yet another possibility, one that ancient texts address more directly. Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly the Book of Enoch, speaks of the Watcher's angels assigned to watch over humanity who instead descended to earth and took human wives. First, Enoch 6:7 describes their leaders, the sons of heaven, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and decided to take them as wives. This produced offspring called Nephilim, giants who were neither fully human nor fully angelic. What if the people in Nod were not purely human? What if they were already hybrid beings, products of earlier angelic interactions with humanity? What if Cain's wife was a daughter of mixed lineage, carrying both human and angelic genetics? This would explain why Cain's descendants showed such remarkable skills in metalworking, music, and crafts. It would explain the origin of the Nephilim. It would explain why God eventually decided to wipe out all flesh through the flood, preserving only Noah's family whose line was still pure. Genesis 6:4 provides a tantalizing hint. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The phrase "in those days" refers back to earlier times before the main narrative of the flood. The Nephilim existed before the specific events of Genesis 6. They were already present during earlier generations, during the generations of Cain's descendants. This suggests that the mixing of angelic and human had been happening for a long time, possibly from the very beginning of Cain's exile. The city of Enoch, then, was not just the first human city, it was the first place of systematic contact between fallen angels and humanity. It was the laboratory where forbidden knowledge was transmitted, where divine boundaries were deliberately crossed, where a new kind of being was intentionally produced. Cain's mark may have been the key to this entire process. If it granted him access to angelic knowledge and protection from death, it also marked him as someone willing to operate outside divine order. The Watchers, already in rebellion against their assigned role, would have recognized Cain as an ally. He had rejected God's authority just as they had. He was building a civilization independent of divine oversight, just as they desired. He was the perfect partner for their agenda. The people who should not exist then are the hybrid offspring of these unholy alliances. They are the giants mentioned in Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33. They are the heroes of old, the men of renown whose stories were told across ancient cultures, the titans of Greek mythology, the demigods of various pantheons, the legendary founders of civilizations. These were not purely mythological figures. They were dim cultural memories of actual beings who once walked the earth, beings of tremendous power and knowledge, beings who were neither fully human nor fully divine. Cain's wife may have been one of these hybrid beings, or she may have been a pure human who later mixed with them. Either way, Cain's line became the vehicle through which angelic knowledge entered human civilization. His descendants, Enoch, Irad, Methuselah, and Lamech each carried forward this forbidden legacy. And with each generation the corruption deepened, the distance from God increased, and the world moved closer to the judgment that would come through water. But here is the most disturbing possibility. If Cain's mark granted him immunity from death, he did not just witness this corruption, he facilitated it. He became the bridge between fallen angels and humanity. He became the first priest of a new religion, one that worshipped knowledge and power rather than holiness. He became the father of all who would seek to transcend human limitations through forbidden means, and his city became the template for every later attempt to build a world without God. Chapter 6. The First City and the First Rebellion. Cities in the ancient world were more than population centers. They were statements of power, declarations of autonomy, physical manifestations of human will imposed on the natural world. Walls separated inside from outside, civilization from wilderness, order from chaos. To build a city was to say, we can create our own safety, we can establish our own law, we can organize our own society. It was fundamentally a claim to sovereignty. Cain's city, named Enoch after his son, was the first such claim. Genesis 4:17 records the act without commentary. He built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. The Hebrew verb bana means to build, to establish, to construct something permanent. This was not a temporary camp. This was not a temporary camp. This was not a collection of tents that could be moved. This was stone and timber and walls. This was intended to last. The symbolism is profound. God had commanded Cain to be a fugitive and a wanderer. Genesis 4:12 declared that he would have no rest, no stability, no settled place. But Cain defied this sentence. He stopped wandering. He gathered people. He organized labor. He built walls. He created exactly what God had said he would not have: a settled place, a home, a legacy. The city was an act of rebellion as significant as the murder itself. This pattern would repeat throughout Scripture. When humanity gathered to build the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, God scattered them because their unity in rebellion was dangerous. When Nimrod built his kingdom in Genesis 10:5 and 8:12, he was described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, a phrase that scholars debate but many interpret as meaning in defiance of rather than in the presence of the Lord. Visites in the biblical narrative often represent human attempts to create security and meaning apart from God. But Cain's city was the prototype. It established the model, and it raises the question: How did Cain acquire the knowledge to build a city? He was raised in a garden in an agricultural setting. He knew how to till the ground, how to plant crops, how to make offerings. But earthen planning, architecture, defensive fortifications, where did these skills come from? The answer may lie in who Cain encountered in Nod. If the land east of Eden was inhabited by others, whether pre-Adamic humans or hybrid beings with angelic knowledge, then Cain gained access to information that had not been given to his parents. The Watchers, according to 1 Enoch chapters 6-8, taught humanity specific arts. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. Samjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Other angels taught astrology, cosmetics, and writing. If Cain was the first human to establish ongoing contact with these fallen beings, then his city was built with their assistance and according to their designs. It was not just a human achievement. It was a collaborative effort between humans and fallen angels, between earthly ambition and supernatural knowledge. The city of Enoch became the first place where the boundaries between human and angelic were deliberately blurred. Genesis 4:17-24 provides the genealogy of Cain's descendants, and this list is revealing. It shows rapid development of civilization. Jabal becomes the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, organized nomadic herding. Jubal becomes the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe, music and culture. Tubal-Cain becomes the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, metalworking and weaponry. Within a few generations, Cain's line has developed animal husbandry, musical arts, and advanced metallurgy. This is an astonishing pace of cultural development. Compare it to the archaeological record of early human civilization, which shows thousands of years between basic agriculture and metalworking. But Cain's descendants accomplished this in a handful of generations. Why? Because they had access to knowledge that was being given, not discovered. They were being taught by beings who already possessed this information. The most disturbing figure in this genealogy is Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-grandson. Genesis 4:19 notes that Lamech took 2 wives, the first recorded instance of polygamy. Then, in verses 23-24, Lamech speaks what is called Lamech's song of vengeance. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. This short poem reveals the moral trajectory of Cain's line. Lamech openly boasts about murder. He claims even greater protection than Cain. He demands escalating vengeance. He represents the multiplication and intensification of sin that began with Cain. What started as a single act of jealous violence has become a culture of violence, a society built on the principle that might makes right, that power justifies itself, that human desire trumps divine law. Lamech's boast also suggests that the mark and protection given to Cain had somehow been extended to his descendants. They carried the immunity, the mark, the access to forbidden power. The entire line was now operating under a different covenant, one that granted power and protection in exchange for complete separation from God. The city of Enoch was not just a physical location. It was a spiritual territory where alternative rules applied. But what happened to this city? The text does not say. The flood narrative in Genesis 6:9 describes total destruction of all flesh except Noah's family. Did the city survive? Were there ruins that later civilizations discovered? Did the knowledge preserved in Enoch's city somehow pass through the flood and re-emerge in later cultures? Some scholars note that the first post-flood city mentioned in scripture is also called Enoch, but this time it is built by Nimrod and called Erech in some translations. Genesis 10:10 lists it among the cities of Nimrod's kingdom. Is this a coincidence? Or did Nimrod discover the ruins of Cain's city and rebuild on the same site, recovering some of the knowledge that had been preserved there? The Bible itself provides a hint. Jude 14:15 quotes from the book of Enoch, referring to Enoch, the 7th from Adam, who prophesied judgment. But there were two Enochs. One was Cain's son, for whom the first city was named. The other was Seth's descendant, the man who walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, according to Genesis 5:24. These two Enochs represent two different paths, one marked by rebellion and building apart from God, the other marked by walking with God so closely that he bypassed death. The tension between these two Enochs, these two paths, defines human history. Will we build our own cities, trusting in our own power and knowledge, or will we walk with God, accepting his authority and guidance? Cain chose the first path. His city was the monument to that choice. And every empire, every civilization, every human attempt to create lasting security and meaning apart from God echoes that original rebellion. Chapter 7: The Sons of Cain. The genealogy of Cain provides one of Scripture's most intriguing contrasts. Genesis 4:17-24 lists 7 generations from Cain to Lamech and his children. Genesis 5 then provides the genealogy of Seth, Adam's third son, born after Abel's death. The two lists run parallel, covering the same general time period, but they describe two very different communities developing side by side. Cain's line is characterized by cultural achievement and technological advancement. They build cities, they develop metalworking, they create music, they organize complex economic systems. But the genealogy climaxes with Lamech, whose violence and polygamy represent moral decay. Seth's line, by contrast, shows less cultural innovation but maintains relationship with God. It culminates in Enoch, who walked with God, and eventually Noah, who finds grace in God's eyes. This parallel development is intentional. The author of Genesis is showing two paths of human development. One prioritizes power, knowledge, and cultural achievement. The other prioritizes righteousness, relationship with God, and moral integrity. One produces impressive civilizations. The other produces people who know God. And the text makes clear which path leads to life. But the sons of Cain deserve closer examination. Each name in the genealogy carries meaning in Hebrew, and these meanings suggest a progression of ideas and values. Enoch means dedicated or initiated. Irad means fleet or fugitive. Mehoshal means smitten of God, or God gives life. Methoshal means man of God, or who is of God. These names show an ironic pattern. Even as Cain's line moves further from God in practice, they continue to reference God in their names. This suggests that Cain's descendants did not reject the idea of God. They simply rejected his authority. They wanted divine power without divine submission. They wanted the benefits of being made in God's image without the responsibilities. This is the essence of occultic spirituality, seeking to acquire divine attributes through forbidden means, through secret knowledge, through alliances with fallen powers rather than through righteous relationship with the Creator. The text specifically highlights 3 sons of Lamech, each founder of a particular skill. Genesis 4:20 introduces Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. This describes organized pastoralism, the domestication of animals, the development of nomadic herding as an economic system. This is sophisticated knowledge requiring understanding of animal behavior, breeding, seasonal migration patterns, and resource management. Verse 21 introduces Jubal, the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. This is the origin of music and performing arts. The lyre and pipe represent string and wind instruments, suggesting a developed musical culture with multiple instrument types, probably musical notation or oral preservation systems, performance traditions, and aesthetic theory. Music is not merely practical knowledge. It involves creativity, emotion, abstract thinking, and cultural transmission. Verse 22 introduces Tubal-Cain, the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. This is metallurgy, one of the most important technological advances in human history. The Bronze Age and Iron Age are named after the materials Tubal-Cain worked with. Metalworking requires mining, smelting, alloying, forging, and toolmaking. It requires understanding of geology, chemistry, and thermodynamics. It is complex, specialized knowledge. The name Tubal-Cain is itself significant. Tubal may refer to working or hammering. Cain obviously connects him to his ancestor. Some scholars suggest Tubal-Cain means offspring of Cain who works metal, or the one who brings forth Cain's work. His name marks him as continuing and advancing his forefathers' legacy of human achievement independent of God. The text also mentions Tubal-Cain's sister, Naamah. Genesis 4:22 simply notes her existence without explanation. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Her name means pleasant or beautiful. Why is she mentioned when other women in the genealogy are not? Jewish tradition provides interesting speculation. Some rabbis taught that Naamah was the wife of Noah, thus bringing Cain's genetic line into the post-flood world. Others suggested she was a seductress who led men astray, associated with the daughters of men who married the sons of God in Genesis 6. The mention of Naamah raises the broader question of women in Cain's line. Lamech had two wives, Ada and Zillah, whose names are recorded. This suggests that women in Cain's civilization had identity and agency beyond just childbearing. They may have participated in the cultural achievements, contributed to the arts and technologies, held economic and social power. The city of Enoch may have been surprisingly sophisticated in its gender dynamics, even as it was morally corrupt. But here is what the text does not say. It does not record any acts of worship or righteousness from Cain's descendants. There are no altars built, no sacrifices offered, no prayers recorded. The genealogy is entirely focused on human achievement, cultural development, technological advancement. God is absent from the narrative except as reference in names. The sons of Cain are building a world where God is remembered but not relevant, acknowledged but not obeyed. This is the real rebellion. Not outright atheism, but practical godlessness. Not denying that God exists, but living as though he does not matter. Building impressive civilizations, creating beautiful art, developing powerful technologies, all without reference to divine purpose or moral accountability. The sons of Cain represent humanity's best achievements pursued for their own sake, divorced from their creator. And this raises a haunting question. How much of later human civilization follows the same pattern? How many of our cities, our technologies, our arts trace their origin not to righteous development guided by God, but to the knowledge first given in Nod, first developed in Enoch, first developed in Enoch, first demonstrated by the sons of Cain? The text suggests that what was destroyed in the flood did not disappear completely. It re-emerged, it continued, and perhaps it continues still. Chapter 8, When Angels Walked Among Men, Genesis 6:1-4, contains one of the most mysterious passages in all of Scripture. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. This passage has generated enormous debate. Who were the sons of God? Who were the daughters of man? What were the Nephilim, and what does this have to do with Cain's story? The connections are subtle but significant. These events occur in the generations before the flood, during the time when both Cain's descendants and Seth's descendants are multiplying. The corruption that leads to the flood does not appear suddenly. It develops over time through a process that involves these mysterious figures. The phrase sons of God in Hebrew is Nai Elohim. In the Old Testament, this phrase consistently refers to angelic beings. Job 1:6 uses it. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Job 2:1 repeats the phrase. Job 38,007 describes the morning stars singing together and the sons of God shouting for joy at creation. In each case, the context makes clear these are not humans but angelic beings, members of the divine council. When Genesis 6 says the sons of God saw the daughters of man and took them as wives, it is describing something unnatural, a crossing of boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Angels are not meant to marry humans. Matthew 22:30 makes this clear. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. The very fact that marriage is happening indicates these angels have rebelled against their nature and purpose. The Book of Enoch, though not canonical, preserves ancient Jewish tradition about this event. First Enoch chapters 6-11 provide detailed narrative. 200 angels called Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. They are led by Semjaza and Azazel. They swear an oath to each other to carry out their plan of taking human wives. They each choose women and begin having relations with them. The women become pregnant and give birth to giants, the Nephilim, who consume all the resources and eventually begin eating humans. The Watchers then begin teaching forbidden knowledge. Azazel teaches men to make weapons of war. Semjaza teaches enchantments and root cutting. Amazarach teaches sorcery. Barakal teaches astrology. Kokabiel teaches signs. Chazakiel teaches knowledge of the clouds. Shemshel teaches signs of the sun. Sariel teaches the course of the moon. These teachings corrupt humanity, introducing violence, sexual immorality, occult practices, and moral chaos. This account in Enoch parallels the development described in Cain's genealogy. The skills that appear among Cain's descendants, metalworking, cultural arts, specialized knowledge, match the skills the Watchers teach humanity. This is not coincidence. It suggests that the city of Enoch was the primary location of contact between fallen angels and humans. Cain's line, already separated from God and marked for protection, became the willing recipients of angelic instruction. The Nephilim, offspring of these unions, were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, according to Genesis 6:4. These were not ordinary humans. They were hybrids, carrying both human and angelic genetics. They possessed supernatural strength and size. Numbers 13,033 described later Nephilim as giants. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. These beings had corrupted the human gene pool. If the Nephilim were allowed to continue, there would soon be no purely human population left. Every person would carry angelic contamination. This is why God decided to destroy all flesh through the flood. Genesis 6:9 specifically notes that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. The Hebrew word translated blameless is tamim, which can mean perfect or complete. Many scholars believe this refers not just to Noah's moral character, but to his genetic purity. He was fully human, uncontaminated by Nephilim ancestry. The flood, then, was not arbitrary judgment. It was surgical intervention. It was God acting to preserve the human race from genetic extinction. It was the only way to eliminate the Nephilim and the knowledge they carried while preserving a remnant of pure humanity through Noah's line. The survival of 8 people on the ark represents the narrowest possible preservation of the human race. But Genesis 6:4 contains an ominous phrase, and also afterward. The Nephilim were on earth before the flood, and also afterward. How did they survive? One possibility is that the angelic incursion happened again after the flood. The fallen angels, not having been destroyed, could repeat their earlier actions. Another possibility is that contaminated genetics passed through the flood somehow, perhaps through one of Noah's daughters-in-law. This would explain why the Nephilim appear later in Canaan, why God commands the Israelites to completely destroy certain populations without mercy. Deuteronomy 20:16-17 commands, "But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction." This seems harsh until you understand that these populations may have been genetically contaminated, carrying Nephilim ancestry that would threaten human purity again. The connection to Cain's story comes full circle. Cain was the first human to rebel completely against God, to reject his authority, to build a civilization independent of divine guidance. His mark and his city made him the natural ally of the Watchers when they descended. His descendants provided the human population willing to mix with angels, willing to receive forbidden knowledge, willing to produce hybrid offspring. Cain's line became the vehicle through which the greatest corruption in human history entered the world. And if Cain himself never died, if his mark granted immunity from age and violence, then he witnessed all of this. He saw the angels descend. He saw his descendants take them as partners. He saw the Nephilim born. He saw the world filled with violence. He saw God's decision to destroy everything. And perhaps, in some mysterious way, he survived. Perhaps the flood that destroyed all flesh could not destroy the one who bore the mark. Perhaps Cain emerged from the waters to continue his wandering in the new world, carrying the memory and the knowledge into yet another age. Chapter 9. The Silence of Adam. One of the most striking absences in the Cain narrative is the voice of Adam. After the murder, God interrogates Cain. God pronounces judgment. God provides the protective mark. But Adam says nothing. He does not confront his son. He does not comfort his son. He does not comfort his wife. He does not mourn Abel publicly in the text. He simply vanishes from the story until Genesis 5, which records his genealogy and death. Why this silence? What does it mean? Some interpreters suggest that Adam was simply overcome with grief, unable to respond. Losing a son to murder at the hands of another son is perhaps the worst tragedy a parent can experience. The pain may have been too great for words. Adam may have been treated into mourning, disconnected from the world, broken by what had happened. This is a compassionate reading, one that honors the depth of human suffering. But there is another possibility. Adam's silence may represent recognition. When he saw what Cain had done, when he heard God's judgment, he may have understood something profound. His own sin in Eden had borne fruit. The rebellion he introduced into creation had manifested in his son. The death that entered the world through his disobedience had taken human form in Cain's hands. Adam was seeing the consequences of his own choice reflected back at him through his child. Genesis 3:19 records God's judgment on Adam. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. But you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Death entered human experience through Adam's sin. Romans 5:12 makes this explicit. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Adam was the vehicle through which death reached humanity. But death in Adam's time was still abstract. He and Eve were cast out of Eden. They lost access to the tree of life. They would eventually die. But they had not yet seen death. They did not know what it looked like. When Abel died, death became visible, concrete, undeniable. Adam saw his son's body. He saw blood on the ground. He saw life ended. And he knew with terrible clarity that this was the result of his own choice in Eden. Cain, as the firstborn, carried something of Adam's nature more directly than Abel. The murderous jealousy, the willingness to reject God's authority, the preference for one's own judgment over divine command. These traits echo Adam's sin. When Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" he was channeling the same spirit that led Adam to say, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." Both responses deflect responsibility. Both refuse to own their actions. Both challenge God's right to hold them accountable. Adam's silence may also reflect impotence. What could he say to Cain? How could he discipline a son who had just killed his brother? What authority did Adam have left after his own catastrophic failure? He had led his entire family into exile from Eden. He had been the one who sinned first. He had been the one who introduced death. Now death had come for his son, delivered by the hand of his other son. Adam was trapped in the consequences of his own rebellion, unable to prevent the escalation, unable to restore what was broken. There is also the possibility that Adam tried to speak and was prevented. The text focuses on God's conversation with Cain. It records divine interrogation and judgment. Human voices are absent. This may be deliberate literary structure, emphasizing that this is a matter between God and Cain, between creator and creature. Or it may reflect spiritual reality. Perhaps Adam attempted to intervene and was stopped, silenced by divine authority. Perhaps God was making clear that this judgment was his alone to pronounce. Jewish tradition preserved in various midrashim provides speculation about Adam's response. Psalm sources say that Adam mourned Abel for 130 years, which is why Genesis 5:3 notes that Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, and that Seth was in Adam's likeness after his image, unlike Cain, who was not described this way. Other traditions say Adam separated from Eve for a time after Abel's death, unable to be intimate because of grief and fear that they would produce more children who would follow Cain's path. The birth of Seth marks the end of Adam's recorded silence. Genesis 4:25 states, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, 'God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him.'" Here, Eve speaks, naming the child and explaining the name. Seth means appointed or granted. He is the replacement for Abel, the continuation of the righteous line. With Seth's birth, hope is restored. The future is not entirely in Cain's hands. But even here, Adam does not speak. Eve names the child. Eve explains the significance. Adam participates through the physical act of conception, but his voice is absent. This pattern suggests that Eve may have been the spiritually stronger figure after the murder. She was the one who processed grief productively. She was the one who looked forward. She was the one who recognized God's mercy in providing another son. Adam remains silent, perhaps broken, perhaps simply having nothing left to say. The silence of Adam becomes a warning about the long-term consequences of sin. Adam's one act of disobedience rippled forward, affecting his children and his children's children. He lived for 930 years according to Genesis 5:50, long enough to see numerous generations of descendants. He witnessed the development of both Cain's corrupt civilization and Seth's righteous line. He saw the world filling with violence. And perhaps the worst part of his punishment was not the hard labor or eventual death, but the knowledge that all of this flowed from his choice. Silence can be more eloquent than speech. Adam's wordlessness speaks volumes about guilt, grief, recognition, and the weight of responsibility. It reminds every reader that sin is never just personal. It affects others. It spreads. It multiplies. What we do echoes in the lives of those who come after us, and sometimes when we see the full consequences of our choices, there is nothing left to say. Chapter 10: The Death That Never Came. Every major figure in Genesis has a death recorded. Genesis 5 provides the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and each entry follows the same formula. So-and-so lived X years and fathered son Y. He lived Z years after fathering son Y and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of so-and-so were W years, and he died. The pattern is consistent, rhythmic, almost liturgical. Life, children, more life, death. Life, children, more life, death. Life, children, more life, death. The repetition emphasizes the consequence of Eden. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. But Cain has no death record. Genesis 4 ends with the genealogy of his descendants through Lamech's and Lamech's children. Then Genesis 5 begins the genealogy of Seth. Cain simply disappears from the narrative. The text never says, "and Cain died." This absence is striking. It is not accidental. The author of Genesis meticulously records deaths. Even Enoch, who walked with God and was not, for God took him, gets an explanation for his departure. But Cain, nothing, silence. This has generated speculation across religious traditions. Jewish mystical texts explore the possibility that Cain was condemned to immortality as punishment. In this interpretation, The mark God placed on Cain did more than protect him from being killed. It prevented him from dying at all. Death would be a mercy, a release from the wandering and guilt. By denying Cain death, God ensured that he would face the consequences of his action forever. Every generation would remind him of what he lost. Every death he witnessed would reflect the death he caused. The Zohar, a foundational work of Jewish mysticism, contains passages suggesting that Cain became a kind of wandering spirit, neither fully alive nor fully dead. He existed in a twilight state, visible to some and invisible to others, moving through the world as a living testimony to the consequences of murder. In this reading, Cain became an archetype, a spiritual reality that transcends individual human life. He is the spirit of jealousy, violence, and fratricide that appears in every generation, influencing those who open themselves to his pattern. Christian tradition has also wrestled with Cain's fate. Some medieval theologians propose that Cain was the origin of certain legendary wandering figures. The story of the wandering Jew, a man cursed to walk the earth until Christ's second coming, has sometimes been connected to Cain. Though the traditional wandering Jew legend involves a person who taunted Christ on the way to crucifixion, some versions suggest this figure was actually Cain, still walking the earth centuries later. Another Christian tradition identifies Cain with various monsters and evil figures. The Old English poem Beowulf claims that the monster Grendel was descended from Cain. The text states that Cain's murder brought exile, and from that exile came all evil broods, ogres and elves and evil shades, as well as the giants who fought against God. This medieval perspective saw Cain not just as an individual, but as the progenitor of all evil creatures, all beings that exist in opposition to God's order. There is also a practical explanation rarely considered. What if Cain did die but the text deliberately omits recording it? What if his death was considered so insignificant, or perhaps so terrible, that it was not worthy of inclusion in the sacred genealogy? Genesis 5 traces the line from Adam through Seth to Noah, the righteous line that will survive the flood. Cain's line is mentioned in Genesis 4, but is not developed further because it ends in the flood. The text may simply not care when or how Cain died because his line does not continue in significance, but this explanation feels insufficient. The author of Genesis is careful with detail. The inclusion of Cain's genealogy down to Lamech's children suggests intentional tracking. The mention of specific innovations, cities, metalworking, music shows interest in Cain's legacy. If Cain had died a normal death, it seems likely the text would record it, if only to emphasize that even the first murderer eventually faced the judgment of death. The most intriguing possibility combines spiritual and literal readings. What if Cain lived an extraordinarily long life, perhaps longer than any other human? What if the mark granted him immunity from violence and disease, allowing him to survive for centuries? He would have witnessed the entire antediluvian period. He would have seen his city flourish. He would have seen the Watchers descend. He would have seen the Nephilim born. He would have seen violence fill the earth. He would have seen God grieve. He would have seen the ark being built. And then comes the question, did Cain die in the flood? Genesis 7:21-23 is explicit. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. If Cain was still alive, he should have died in this judgment, unless the mark protected him even from the flood, unless the one who was cursed from the ground could not be destroyed by water, unless God's sevenfold vengeance promise applied even to divine judgment. This stretches credibility, yet the text's silence leaves room for speculation. There is one final tradition worth noting. Some ancient sources claim that Cain was eventually killed by Lamech, his own descendant. According to this legend, Cain lived so long that his appearance changed, making him unrecognizable. Lamech, who was blind, was hunting with his son Tubal-Cain as guide. Tubal-Cain saw something moving in the bushes and told his father to shoot. Lamech did and killed Cain. When they discovered what happened, Lamech was overcome with grief and accidentally killed Tubal-Cain as well. This would explain Lamech's song in Genesis 4:2023-24 about killing a man and claiming 77-fold vengeance. He was confessing to accidentally killing the original Cain. Whether this legend has any historical basis is impossible to determine, but it represents an attempt to answer the question that the text leaves open. What happened to Cain? Did he ever face final judgment, or does he still wander? Chapter 11. The shadow that still walks. If Cain never died, or if his death is irrelevant to his ongoing influence, then he is not merely a historical figure, he is a present reality. He is a present reality. He is a spiritual archetype that continues to manifest in human experience. Every act of jealous violence echoes his original murder. Every person who rejects God's authority and builds their own kingdom follows his pattern. Every civilization that prioritizes power and knowledge over righteousness walks in Cain's footsteps. This is the terrifying possibility that the text's silence suggests. Cain is not just the first murderer, he is the prototype of all murder. He is not just the founder of the first city, he is the spirit behind all attempts to create human order apart from divine guidance. He is not just marked, he is the mark itself. A permanent sign within human nature that we are capable of ultimate rebellion. 1 John 3:12 makes this connection explicit. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Notice the phrase, of the evil one. Cain is described as belonging to the evil one, originating from evil. This suggests that Cain's action was not merely human sin, but had a deeper spiritual source. He was influenced by, perhaps even controlled by, the adversary. This means that Cain's legacy is not just genetic or cultural, it is spiritual. There is a Cain principle that operates in human history, a pattern of behavior and thinking that reproduces itself generation after generation. Whenever someone chooses violence over peace, power over service, jealousy over contentment, they are operating in the spirit of Cain. They are continuing the legacy that began in that field when Abel's blood soaked into the ground. The mark of Cain, in this spiritual reading, is not just something God placed on one individual. It is something that can be received by anyone who makes the same choices. When we reject God's verdict on our lives, when we refuse to accept his authority, when we harm others in pursuit of our own desires, we take on the mark. We become spiritual descendants of Cain, even if we are biological descendants of Seth. This explains why the Bible repeatedly warns against the way of Cain. Jude 11 pronounces woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. The way of Cain is a recognizable path, one that people still walk. It is characterized by self-will, rejection of divine authority, jealousy of others' righteousness, and willingness to destroy what cannot be controlled. The city Cain built continues to exist in every human civilization that operates without reference to God. Rome, Babylon, Athens, Alexandria, Paris, London, New York, each in its own way represents humanity's attempt to create order, meaning, beauty, and power through human effort. These cities have produced magnificent achievements. They have also produced tremendous evil. They embody the ambiguity of Cain's legacy, great capability alongside great corruption. Modern technology, in some ways, represents the fulfillment of Cain's vision. We now have power that ancient people could not imagine. We can manipulate atoms, alter genetics, create artificial intelligence, reshape entire ecosystems. We build virtual cities, digital networks, systems that connect the entire world. And we do all this with minimal reference to God, minimal consideration of divine purpose, minimal accountability to moral law that transcends human preference. The innovations of Cain's descendants, metalworking, music, animal husbandry, urban planning, were not evil in themselves, but they were developed outside God's direct guidance and often used for purposes contrary to His will. The same is true of modern capabilities. The tools are neutral. The question is, who guides their use and toward what end? When we build, create, and innovate without seeking divine wisdom, we risk repeating Cain's fundamental error. There is also the question of violence. Cain committed the first murder. His descendant Lamech boasted of killing. Genesis 6:11 reports that the earth was filled with violence before the flood. Human history since then has been marked by continuous violence, wars, genocides, murders, terrorism. Every generation produces its Cains, people who take life because they cannot control it, who destroy because they cannot create. The spiritual reality of Cain's continuing influence is perhaps most evident in the phenomenon of fratricide, brother killing brother. This happens literally in families. It happens metaphorically in churches where believers attack each other. It happens in nations where civil war tears communities apart. Whenever people who should be united by common origin or common purpose instead turn to violence, the spirit of Cain is at work. But there is hope. The story of Cain is not the only story. The line of Seth produced Enoch, who walked with God. It produced Noah, who found grace. It eventually produced Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, and finally Jesus Christ, the second Adam, as Paul calls him in 1 Corinthians 15:45, undid what the first Adam introduced. Jesus' shed blood speaks a better word than Abel's blood, as Hebrews 12:24 declares, where Cain's blood guilt-stained the earth and demanded vengeance, Jesus' blood cleanses and offers mercy. Where Cain's mark set him apart for wandering and exile, the mark of Christ through baptism and the Holy Spirit sets believers apart for adoption and homecoming. Where Cain built a city to create his own security, Jesus prepares a city whose builder and maker is God, a new Jerusalem where righteousness dwells. The question for every person is which line they will belong to. Will we follow the pattern of Cain, trusting in our own power, building our own kingdoms, rejecting divine authority? Or will we follow the pattern of Seth, Enoch, Noah, and ultimately Christ, submitting to God's authority, walking in His ways, building according to His design? Cain's shadow still walks through history, but it does not have to define our future. The same God who marked Cain to preserve him also marked Seth's line to bless them. The same God who judged the antediluvian world also preserved Noah's family. The same God who allows the pattern of Cain to continue also offers a better pattern through Jesus Christ. The story of Cain ends with silence, with absence, with the unanswered question of his ultimate fate. But the larger biblical story does not end there. It moves through Seth to Abraham, to David, to Jesus, tracing a line of redemption that runs parallel to the line of rebellion. And in the end, Scripture promises that the cities of Cain will fall, the kingdoms built on human power will crumble, and the city of God will stand forever. Where is Cain now? Perhaps still wandering, still marked, still bearing the consequences of that first murder. Or perhaps he finally faced judgment, his long life finally ended, his spiritual influence separated from his physical presence. The text does not tell us, but it tells us enough. It warns us that sin has lasting consequences. It shows us that violence perpetuates itself. It reminds us that the earth itself witnesses and remembers what we do, and it points us toward a better way, a righteous way, the way that leads not to exile but to home.